Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to the first webinar that the BCS Data Management Specialist Group have tried. This is a little bit of an experiment in order to see how we can better interact with members who either don't want to or can't easily get down to London for some of our meetings. My name is Julian Schwarzenbach. I'm Chair of the BCS Data Management Specialist Group, and with me tonight helping to provide if you like, an example of the case for data management is Glen Vaal. So Glen is our event secretary. You want to say hello, Glen?
Good evening, everyone.
What we're doing tonight is, there we go. Quick content really is about why bother managing data, what does data management include, what's the future for data management, careers in data management, and then just a little bit about how to learn more, and then we'll just try and answer any questions that you might have towards the end. And here we are, we've got the head-banging hedgehog, so that's over to Glen.
Okay, yes. So the point about this was, with anybody who's got the experience of projects, you usually know that you raise a hand about data or, dirty data, cleaning data, and nobody wants to know. Everybody wants to talk about what's going to happen, what the processes are, who takes what role, and so on and so forth. But data is a poor second.
And so one of the things that I think we all need to recognise is that any business activity, in theory, it should support the strategy of the organisation. There should be some governance in place to make sure it goes according to plan. And typically, each business activity, you'll have a process, there'll be data that's an input and output from that process. Software automates the process, and then you've got people who are the actors of that process. Unfortunately, for many organisations, and I think most of you might recognise this, because the software very often comes with a name attached to it and a large price ticket, very often for a project, that is where all the focus is. And yet, as you might know, the old garbage in, garbage out saying, very often the data is the thing that's forgotten about. It's the one that is left behind. And if data isn't looked after within a project, then you're risking making everything far worse for yourself as an organisation. And one of the things we need to think through is in many organisations, in many different contexts, data is required for making some pretty tough, pretty complex decision making. So thinking about the asset world, thinking about power stations, trying to work out what maintenance to do, what assets to replace and when, that requires a huge amount of data to allow it to happen. In a medical environment, lots of data needed to allow surgeons and clinicians to make the right decisions about the treatment options for a patient. Think about finance, think about manufacturing, or any particular context. In this day and age, there's just huge amounts of data. You're all familiar with the term big data, and people get more carried away with data, but they aren't always getting better at how they manage that data.
And I think the point about those examples we're seeing there is that this data isn't just a static set of values, it's actually streaming through. So in the medical environment, you've got the vital signs being constantly monitored, and if something steps out of range, then it's going to be reported on. Likewise, in the finance area, you have streaming data. In production, streaming data is so much more difficult to handle, and if that data is not accurate and timely, obviously the wrong decisions will be made.
Yeah. So within organisations, I mean, there will be many data sets for most organisations. These are just some of the examples typically of what you might encounter. But for each of those systems, there will be quite a complex data model, many tables of data. But what you'll also find is that quite often that data will be repeated across different data sets. So you're dealing with a complex landscape. You're dealing with a master data problem of where is the actual master data source for quite a few of those. But also you're dealing with a huge variety of different types of data. So it could be image data, it could be documents, video, audio. It might be, if you're in the oil sector, it might be logging data from boreholes, things of that nature. It's a huge amount of complexity. So we're dealing with a very complex landscape.
And what I'd like to add to that is that, as well as the straightforward numbers or letters or pictures or audio files or the video files, you've got the metadata, the data about that data. When was that picture taken? who took it, on what device was it taken, what format is this video being transmitted in, all those different aspects which are absolutely key to understanding of the data, which has to be known and stored as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that I quite often get people to do is to think about, for your organization, if you were to visualize it as a machine, of what sort of machine would you visualize the way you manage your data? Is it a big bit of yellow plant? Is it big, robust? Is it fairly meaty and able to shift a lot of rock? Is it able to do all you need? Or is it perhaps a little bit more of a Heath Robinsonish affair? Now, I think for many organisations, if you think about the number of times there might be a few Excel spreadsheets that exist alongside the enterprise system, there might be a few of the interfaces between systems that don't work quite as planned. For most organisations, they're actually more towards the Heath Robinson end of the scale, and yet the exec may have just paid a fortune out for an enterprise system and they think they've got the big yellow plant. So very often there is a disconnect between what the exec think they're paid for and what the organisation is actually doing. And there are many other ways of visualising it. One of the things also that came out, I was talking to a security seminar last week, is the big robust bit of plant gives you an easy option for doing security management. However, if you've got the Heath Robinson approach with all the workarounds, all the spreadsheets, from a data security perspective, that's a bit of a nightmare. So it is important to think about and recognise that across an organisation, data is not just the things that the enterprise officially supports through IT, it is also all the Excel spreadsheets and everything else. One of the things also to consider is when we're talking about data quality, is okay having terabytes of data sitting on a server or sitting in the cloud somewhere, but is that data actually of a suitable quality to allow you to do what you're doing as an organisation? One of the things to think through is a bit like describing the weather as being bad. Do you mean the weather is too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, too windy? If you're talking about data, you need to think about the different attributes that you've got there, which are typically, when people are talking about data quality dimensions or data quality attributes, they talk about accuracy, completeness, consistency, timeless, validity, and uniqueness. So accuracy, does the data represent the thing that it's supposed to? Is all your data complete? Is it consistent? So if you've got employee data in 3 or 4 different systems, does it actually have the same name and details for that employee? Timeliness, how promptly are updates being fed into the system when there are changes in the real world? What data formats have you got? Is it valid data that you've got? And finally, have you got one and only one entry for each entity that you're worried about as an organisation?
I think it's worth mentioning here that the accuracy and validity of the data is becoming more and more important when we start talking about AI systems. And indeed, the presentation that we had last week about fake news and so on becomes even more important when you consider is that news, is that information come from a valid source, and is it worth it? And for anybody who'd like to know more about that, please do look on our BCS DMSG website and have a look at the YouTube of last week's presentation. It's very, very good, by Nick Poole in particular.
Yeah. One of the key things, though, is that you might find that there are quite a few companies out there who sell data profiling software, which is good at telling you some of your data quality, very good at, for instance, the completeness and consistency, validity and uniqueness, but it's not always the answer that you might expect. So if you're looking at example data here, if you've got data which looks complete, looks reasonably valid based on what's there, looks plausible, but if that's the table that's being represented by that data, you'll see that it's not a pine table, it's actually changed, it's different. So actually there's an accuracy issue. So just because the data is valid and complete and plausible doesn't actually mean it's right. And there is an example of a large infrastructure organisation in the UK where for many years they've been putting off doing data accuracy checks. They finally went out and checked their operational buildings last year, and there's many thousands of them. They found that 10% of the ones they got data on no longer existed, but more worryingly, they found an equivalent of another 20% that had been built and they got no record of them. So it's a really good example where data accuracy is a challenge that you need to address as an organisation, and that software-based profiling tools won't tell you the answer. So why is data quality important? So there's a few examples here, and the animation skips straight through, but you get the idea. I think everybody's got examples where there are data problems, they cause issues for the organisation. There's kind of the underlying pain that people are living with on a day in, day out basis caused by problems with the data. All the time that people have to spend bringing different data sets together to come up with an answer that will then go into that week's KPIs and reports. And when it comes to strategic decision making, you've got some real challenges there if you can't trust the data.
And there's been news items recently talking about early AI systems where people have used historic data to test those AI systems, and actually finding the results are a combination of being racist, ageist, and sexist. So these are things that really do need looking at quite closely.
Yeah, that was a certain well-known online shopping store, I think, in their recruitment policies. In effect, it was just repeating what they've always done in the past rather than what they were trying to do. So, yeah, so data quality, the impact of data quality can be very significant on organisations. Also worth thinking through, and this goes back to one of the earlier slides there about the interaction between software and data. If you're thinking about typical software projects, they don't start with an empty container. You're going to have some data. Where's that data going to come from? Typically, it will be from the existing system that you've already got. Typically, for IT projects, they've got a sort of a 20% failure rate. For data migration projects a few years ago, the failure rate was about 80-odd% failure rate in terms of time, cost, and quality. And one of the issues is that if you aren't managing your data effectively, you might have perfect software, it does everything that it said on the tin that you intended as the organisation, but the thing that lets it down is the fact that the data has been migrated badly and you've actually corrupted what you've got. And certainly I've come across a few examples where the first time new software was rolled out, the users went back to the data they always knew was wrong, looked at it and said, well, you still haven't fixed that data, the software is rubbish. And, so that's an example where it's the data was the issue, not the software. But the two are very much wrapped one against the other.
And indeed, just before this webinar started, several of us were talking that if you're in a project management role, it's very wise to check if the data is fit for purpose, because there's nothing like a last-minute data failure to add months onto your project timeline just when you don't need it. I was working on a project for a very large public organisation, and I made the mistake of saying that we needed to clean the data. They were very offended and said, we've been paying these people for many years, always accuracy. So who are you to tell us that our data is dirty? The real thing that was going on was that because the software was changing, it was using the data in a different way. When we actually went through and tested, fortunately we tested our existing data against the new software well in advance, and indeed it was found to be unfit for purpose, and indeed we had to do 3 months worth of data cleanup, for want of another word. But until that point it wasn't recognised, and next time we'll be more careful with the words.
And I think there are plenty of other examples out there about failed data migration, but it just helps me to reiterate why data is important. So in terms of understanding why data is difficult to manage, the problem we've got is that we've actually got many different data sources. We've got local data stores, all those wondrous Excel spreadsheets that people lovingly create and nurture throughout the organisation that may be not visible by IT. Even with the corporate systems that you've got that are officially supported, you've got many business processes that interact with them. The software systems you've got, maybe they don't all interact with each other. You've got different users. Even within the system, you might think you've explained to everyone how they're supposed to enter the data, but they may all choose to do something very differently. And so there's a whole load of different things that mean that data is actually quite a difficult thing to manage. And that's part of the topic and part of the thing that keeps us going on a day in, day out basis, is this challenge about how do we make organisations do data better. So over to Glen now.
Right, so often people have a problem saying, well, what exactly do you mean by data management? And the answer is it does actually comply to many, many different things. The first place most of us would start will be on the technical side. How are we going to store the data? and how are we going to report on it? What software are we going to use? And that has changed significantly in the last few years. It used to be that everything was very tabular, and you could report on it using SQL type tools. But as hopefully many of you know, now we are not restricted by tabular structures, and you have non-SQL or not only SQL type products out there, which bring us large advantages, both in terms of development, because you don't have to do complex data analysis in advance, and I mean, really don't. And also, when you want to expand those systems, you can just add the fields without the significant data migration and data rebuild and so on that you would have to do in the past. So the technical side advancing fast, and it's a very interesting area to work in. On the security side, more and more we are learning about the hacking attacks and so on, who should have access to what, whether it's in health services, whether it's public information, anything to do, and particularly when it comes down to the GDPR legislation which has come through. So here we have a combination of the legislation and the security aspects which have really come to the fore over the last 24 months or so. Governance is the process that is necessary within an organisation to ensure that the data is fit for purpose and that the asset, that is the company's data, is maintained and of value in the future. You put all those aspects together and you have a plethora of roles involved with data, which we're going to go on and discuss in a moment.
Yeah, but one other thing to add in there, so Glenn mentioned about GDPR, and I think that's been a really good example for the data management community of something raising the profile of data and making people realise it is a bit more important, but also it's a good example of people getting perhaps taking their eye off the ball, assuming it was just an event, that once you've done past the May deadline earlier this year, that's it, you don't need to worry about it. And I think there's quite a few organisations starting to find it's something they need to keep a focus on going forward. So one of the things that worth thinking through, and Glenn briefly mentioned there about data governance, this is an example of the conceptual model that's in the middle of ISO 8000 Part 150, is just a framework for data quality management. The ISO 8000 series talks about data quality from a number of different perspectives. Part 150 gives us that framework for how you do data quality management. I won't go into all the details of that because that's a whole presentation in itself, but it's worth saying that you can add on a few extra factors, think about the culture, the organisation, escalation process and change control, and that in effect gives you a framework for data governance within an organisation. And so then it gives you a tool, gives you a mechanism and a framework to allow the executive organisation, senior level people, to have an input into the data governance. So moving on to Glenn, sort of thinking through about the future side of things.
Yeah, well, what are we seeing? We're seeing an increasing number of challenges in the security area. The responsibility to ensure security of personal data has been brought to the fore with GDPR, but there was always security aspects to protect data, because what else are your data? You're not protecting functionality, you're protecting data from either leakage or getting into the wrong hands or being processed incorrectly, inappropriately. The legislation on GDPR, we had a conference with the Dharma group this year, and really we began to talk about what next after GDPR. We are quite clear that this is not the end of it. It's not going to continue. It's not going to stay as it is at the moment. We're going to actually see far more demanding requirements continuing in this area. And that again is quite a deep subject on that one, but it won't stand still. There'll be more legislation. I touched just now on the technology side. I'm particularly interested in the different tools which are coming through, not only in terms of how to store that data, but indeed how to use it. We had a presentation, not actually last year, but the year before that, from British Telecom, who have a huge amount of data that they keep. Every single transaction, every single phone call that goes through, they maintain and store, and they put it into a large Hadoop database. And they talk about schema on read. So they turn data analysis upside down. They wait until they know what they want to, the question they want to ask, and then they devise the schema that will answer the question they need, and then they build that schema from there, for want of another word, data lake. Very fascinating area, and they use a whole raft of different analytical tools in order to get out. And as several of you will know, there's many different data analytics tools coming out, and it's still being developed. Some in the public sphere, some you pay for. Okay, increasing recognition of the requirement for data governance. Well, I think as we move towards automated tools, AI tools, this is going to become more and more important, because no longer will that decision pass through a pair of eyes first before it actually comes out. And when we begin to see bias, it'll be because of the data.
I think that also gets into a topic that is growing in importance at the moment, and that of data ethics, about the ethical use of data. I think Cambridge Analytica is a good example of where things go a bit wrong, and a good case study to make people realise that just because people have got that data, just because you clicked on share for something, doesn't always mean that the people who are accessing your data have got the best intentions at heart. So it's been a useful wake-up call for many people. So in terms of careers in data management, there are many roles. Some of these are relatively new roles. The role of Chief Data Officer, that is relatively new, but I think it's a very welcome addition to the range of careers, options that you might have in the world of data. But then you can add in data manager, data architect, variants on the name of security and compliance officers. The data scientists, the ones who are at the moment the rock stars in the data world, but then typically lots of other business analysts and project managers, and that list is not exhaustive. There are many other examples of where data fits within a particular role.
I think it's fascinating, actually, the data analyst. It was that the data analyst work was all done up front, looking at the data, analysing it, seeing how it was structured and so on. Now that's really gone almost to the back end, and certainly if anybody out there is still called a data analyst, they want to be called a data scientist these days. You get far more money.
Yeah, definite career enhancement that way. Yeah. So in terms of, if we've whetted your appetite, if we've proven to you that there is a case for data management, if you want to find out a little bit more, then join the BCS, join the Data Management Specialist Group, come along to some of our events. We run 5, 6, 7 a year. This is the first webinar, but we plan to run some more webinars to give people a bit more access to those. Dharma website, that is also a good source of information, and they also run their own events. We also have a joint event, typically each June, where Dharma and ourselves meet for a day. A company called IRM, they do quite a few conferences throughout the year, but their master data management, data governance, enterprise data and BI conferences are all very good events to get along to. If you can get your employer to pay for them, that's good. Most organisations, they have GDPR. It's been a project. It's now hopefully settled down to business as usual. But getting involved in that and finding out a bit more about it is another good way of understanding more about data management. Within projects, we mentioned the challenge around data migration. There are a couple of methodologies. Johnny Morris wrote the book, Practical Data Management, Practical Data Migration. That's a good reference source there if you want to find out more. And on the security side, there are a whole range of standards coming out about data security, not just ISO 27000, but various other ones. And then finally, in terms of data analytics, big data, there are a whole load of different technologies and tools and approaches that are coming to the fore there. So that's just given a very quick run through and made us the case for data management. So hopefully we've managed to convince you that there are reasons for us all being here doing data management. Now's an opportunity there if you've got questions you'd like to ask of us, where you would like a bit more explanation. If you want to just type into the console, we can then answer those questions as they come up. We'll try and answer as many as we can. So over to you, really. So thank you for listening. We'll also be sending out an email just to get a bit of feedback from you in terms of how you found the webinar. Did it work for you? Suggestions for how we can make it better for the next time around. And also we have recorded this, so that we'll also be going up onto YouTube later on anyway. So over to you. If you want to post your questions on the panel, we'll see where we go. So far we have none, so we've answered all your questions.
Here's one. What about the role of data ownership?
Okay, I'll start on that one. I think that's a really good question. Many organisations, they talk about data ownership, and if you remember when I was giving the example about why it's a challenge managing data, is the fact that you've got many processes that interact with the data, and that makes it very, very difficult. You may have a database, a data store, which has got lots and lots of people involved in it, lots of processes interacting with it. So if you give somebody the role of being data owner, that is an accountability without any responsibility to manage it effectively. So there's a real challenge there. One of the things that I suggest is worth considering is actually looking at process ownership rather than data ownership. If you define the roles that are related to sort of make sure that for a process that the input and the output data is well managed, then it will mean that the data itself actually gets better looked after. So I've got another question here.
Final year of computing and IT student with the Open University, interested in moving into data engineering. Any tips how to get into the industry?
I think part of it is about actually having a bit of passion. So there are, as we mentioned in the previous slide, there are many, many different roles where you can get involved in data. And I think from a data engineering perspective, I'm reading that as large-scale sort of movement, manipulation, management of data. Yes, get stuck in. If you can get into a project, if you can start to get involved, that'll be really good. With big data analytics being a bit of a sexy subject at the moment, that is a good area to start. But it does actually, it means if you can find an area, if you find something that's of interest to you, something you're passionate about, that will also add a lot to it.
I would keep an eye on the news. I would ask your local borough councils, any work, because often people think that anything to do with their data is hard work, but it's, depending on how you're built, it's actually very interesting work. And if you show an interest, you can go and get some work experience to actually get involved in there, and then you make yourself irreplaceable. So I would certainly recommend sticking your neck out a bit, asking these people, saying you want to help with it, and you will get a good reaction, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that's good. Talking about data validity, viewpoints on ontologies and vocabularies. I mean, there are a whole range of terms that you can use there. One of the key things that I am quite getting more passionate about as time goes on is following data standards. Actually develop a data standard and follow it as an organisation. But don't always start with a blank sheet of paper, because very often there are a number of standards that already exist that are either industry specific, or there might be an ISO standard that defines data standards in a particular area. So thinking in terms of oil and gas, you've got ISO 14224, production, there's the whole ISO 10303 suite of standards. So there are already a number of standards out there. And if you start to follow the standards, it just makes it a lot easier for people to then you share information with other people, and it avoids you having to reinvent the wheel. There's an analogy that goes around quite a bit of people complaining they've got 15 different standards within the organisation, so they better create a standard to unify all those standards. So then you've got 16 standards you need to deal with, and again, people want to unify that. So there's a bit of a challenge there around that.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, it was last week when we had our fake news presentation. A co-speaker to Nick Paul was Helen Lippel, and she's very much a doer on the side of ontologies. So her presentation is up on our website. She had a bit of a cold, so bear with her. But actually, she's someone who's working in the field of ontology right now. So do by all means, go onto our website and have a look. It's on the YouTube link, by the way.
Yes, so there is a BCS member groups channel which has got videos from all the different member groups who are doing the recordings there. We've got a data management playlist, and so all our presentations are there. So you can actually go back about 3 or 4 years now with the videos that we put up there, so that's quite useful there. Placements and internships and experience. A placement seems more beneficial for a software engineer such as myself. What are your thoughts? I think it's about trying to get going back to the previous answer, is actually finding something you're passionate about. There's no point going into anything like that without having a bit of interest in the subject. And whether it's a particular topic, a particular technology you want to exploit, you can, or that you've actually got a subject area, so maybe you're doing some work with a particular charity and you want to further what they do. It's getting a bit of passion in what you do. So that's one of the things I'd recommend. I think whether it's a placement, an internship, I think that's really down to what's available. So I think if you're in London and the southeast, the economy is typically fairly active, and so you've probably got more opportunities available to you. If you're in other areas of the country, it might be a little bit harder to find the perfect one. So I think just go with the flow. Don't rule out something because you think, actually, I'm looking for a permanent role and they're only offering me a placement. If you've got your foot in the door, if you're demonstrating value, if you're demonstrating that you're solving problems for an organisation, they will find ways to keep you on if they can. Just let me see,
We've got a few here in respect of getting into the business.
Yeah, so we're just skimming up and down. We've got a number of questions. We're just trying to look through the ones that we've got and work out which ones we've answered. Yep. So I think we've actually answered most of the questions we've got come up. So if there's any last questions, feel free to type them into the box. But if not, we'll just give you another moment on that. Also, I think one of the things we will be doing is looking at, when we do the feedback, so getting ideas for future webinars. So that'll be useful to get your thoughts on that one. Is it difficult to learn new? So the question that's come through there, which I think is an interesting one there. So the question is data management evolving at a fast rate? Is it wise to pursue a role in it? Is it difficult to learn new technologies? I would argue that there's two sides to it. So you have, for people who are software developers, very often they have what you might term a sprint mindset, particularly if they're working in an agile environment. They just want to do something and then scarper on to the next thing. Typically, people who are data managers, they've got more of a marathon mindset. They know that this is something that's going to keep going day in, day out, month in, month out, and you need to be delivering more value. I think the question there about changing technologies, I think the thing that you need to think about is more about the application of the technologies. When I ran a small team of analysts, one of the things I found endlessly fascinating was that as people came into the team and moved on, each one typically came in with a different skill set, but they all were able to deliver value because they got that questioning mindset of how do I answer an internal customer's problem, forming a dialogue with the customer, finding out what they needed to do, delivering an output, delivering value. And so it's actually more about that questioning mindset and learning how to apply the technology to answer a question, rather than it is about trying to find out what the latest, sexiest technology is and getting carried away with the sexiness of it. Data management is more of a marathon mindset. It's more of that ongoing thing about delivering value to an organisation.
Having said that, I think in terms of the new technologies, it's very much the IT manager's job to decide what that should be, because any organisation can't afford to implement the latest technologies they see. Otherwise, they'd be implementing a new technology every week. So that can't happen. There will become standards, and certainly we are seeing standards such as R, for example. R for data analytics is becoming very common. So this is something you don't do alone.
I think probably the next question there, but you're probably better able to answer that than me.
Oh, yeah. Do you have any tips on mastering SQL, Oracle? Any resources which are useful to look at? Okay. It's a personal view, but my view would be don't. Unless you're going to work for an old organisation which has made a huge investment in Oracle, such as British Telecom. They have such a huge investment in Oracle that they use it for all their production systems. They take the data out of Oracle, they put it into a Hadoop data lake, and then they use any number of different analytical tools as appropriate to get the answers out. So actually, for the future, I would be aware of SQL. I certainly wouldn't go and learn Oracle unless it was with a company like BT and they wanted me to do probably quite a boring job. No, move forward with the new analytic tools would be my personal answer, but I'm up for argument on that one.
But I think also if you do have a passion for data and you're interested in data management, it is actually a very large topic with many different ways that you can actually demonstrate value to an organisation. So as you probably gathered from the way the questions were handled, I'm less of a technical person. I'm more interested in how organisations manage their data and exploit it and get the most out of it. So it's very much about looking at the organisation as a whole and thinking about how it exploits its data. But other people will get into the minutiae of how to actually deliver insight based on large and complex data sets, which is a very, very different skill set. So it's really down to, there's a lot of openings there. It's down to you to find the one that works best for you.
Yeah, I mean, you followed up with a question there about which analytic tools. Well, certainly R, R is out there, but otherwise there are 20 or so tools out there. Depending on what jobs you want. You look at the who's the big consultancy company that do that? Is it? They do their the Gartner reports. Yes, have a look at Gartner reports, and you'll see which ones are supposedly the leading analytic products. There's old school ones like Cognos there, which are still in the frame coming through. But really, there are a lot of different products, and you'll have to do some research there. But look at Gartner reports.
I think also it's worth remembering that for any analytics to be any good, you've got to have three things in place. So if you've chosen the tool, you know how to make it work, that's great, but you also need some subject matter expertise. You cannot provide good analytics without understanding the data that you're looking at. And then finally, going back to the question about data quality, is you also need to understand the quality of the data that you're processing. So it's not saying that you have to have perfect data, you just need to understand the nature of that data. So it may be a data set that is only 90% complete. It may be what you have, 20% can be discounted because it was corrupted as part of a data migration a few years ago. So there's a number of things there that you can think through, but for analytics to be worthwhile and to deliver value to the organisation, you need to bring together the tool set, the subject matter expertise and data of known quality. And having, as I mentioned earlier, having that questioning mindset, talking through to your internal customers or your external customers to understand what it is they want to solve their problems.
Certainly many people who get into that data field have actually come up through the business and business management. They haven't necessarily done it through IT. That doesn't obviously IT helps in IT knowledge helps in some aspects of data management, but in others it's not necessarily the best route.
Yeah. The question slightly earlier up the list there was in terms of assessing the maturity of organisations and whether they're any good or not. And that framework that ISO 8000 gives you is actually quite a good framework for understanding how good an organisation is, because it gives you a number of things that you would expect to see in an organisation. And if they're not present, that gives you a good idea that there's an area for improvement. One of the areas that ISO 8000 is quite hot on, which I do think is very sensible, is looking at root cause analysis. So if you've got a data quality problem, what was the cause of that? And it may well have been a training issue, it may well be a system interface that wasn't configured correctly. So if you can deal with the training issue, then actually that's going to solve a lot of your data quality problems in the future. So I think in the interest of time, we're sort of we've been going nearly 40 minutes now. We've still got, most people are still on, there's nobody dropped off yet. I think we'll probably wrap it up at that.